Dirt road in a gooseneck, saddle up with me. Dry land in God's country, crops far as I can see. The headlights on both ends of my heat day. This country life is for me. Ride with us, HPJ. Ride with us, HPJ.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Latsky, and I'm the Associate Editor for High Plains Journal. I'll be your moderator for High Plains Journal's first ever virtual Cattle U. This first session will feature Dr. Miles Theurer. You know, for 70 years, High Plains Journal has been a weekly fixture in your mailboxes, and I know that for sure because it was that way at our household. We began these in-person U events more than a decade ago as a way to expand our continuing education for you, our readers. Today, whether via our flagship print publication, our online website, hpj.com, our weekly HPJ Direct newsletters, or even now our podcast, HPJ Talk, the mission stays the same. Bring the news, commentary, and education to our neighbors on the farms, ranches, and ag operations in the High Plains. That mission stays the same even in the midst of a global pandemic. Like all of you, we wish we could be conducting this Cattle U in person this year, but safety had to come first. And so we and our very gracious and flexible speakers and sponsors have pivoted to this virtual platform. Now, before we get started, we want to invite you to stand where you are and join us in welcoming Kansas State FFA officers, Vice President Abby Johnson, President Elizabeth Sturgis, and Treasurer Hattie Polson as they lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you so much, ladies, for that stirring start to our day. You know, High Plains Journal is a proud supporter of FFA and 4-H youth across our coverage area. This last spring, we ran a promotion donating 25% of every subscription we sold to FFA chapters of our subscribers' choosing. We were able to donate more than $23,000 from subscribers' generosity. And most importantly, we created opportunities for the next generation of agricultural entrepreneurs. Now, some housekeeping notes. I'm sure many of you have had experience with the Zoom webinar platform the last 7 months. But for those of you who may be unfamiliar with how this works, let me share some notes. First off, we have already muted your video and microphones. If you have any questions, and honestly, that's exactly what we hope to see, we ask that you click on the chat box below and type your questions in the pop-up box that appears to the side of your screen. We've built in plenty of time to ask questions during the webinar. All of these sessions will be recorded, and the recordings will be posted soon after we're done at cattleu.net. The schedule of sessions and speakers is posted there as well. Remember, if you miss a session live, you can always catch up with the recordings later at your convenience. Now, our first session topic is brought to you by High Plains Feedyard, LLC of Montezuma, Kansas. Since 1999, High Plains Feedyard has established a reputation as one of the elite feed yards in Southwest Kansas. This 50,000 head feed yard is located in the heart of cattle feeding country. The plentiful and local feed supply, as well as packing house demand from nearby Liberal, Dodge City, and Garden City, Kansas, means Tom Jones and the employees at High Plains can make every single head count. With many facility improvements over the last 5 years, from the equipment to the feed mill, perhaps the most outstanding addition to High Plains Feedyard has been the High Plains Education and Research Center, which opened in 2017. The Education and Research Center offers a controlled environment and support staff to collaborate on science-based research and the capacity to educate through aggressive consumer outreach. With the overarching goal of improving efficiencies through the value chain, customer service, and the best practice management for more sustainable global beef production. This state-of-the-art facility has been designed from the ground up to house ongoing research benefiting food animal producers and consumers globally. Beef industry stakeholders have come from far and wide to learn how to use science and tech to improve efficiency and the health of their herds, increase outputs, add value to their cattle, and sustain an affordable food supply for a growing planet. To learn more about High Plains Feedyard's elite feeding research, or to learn how Tom Jones and the staff can help you meet your cattle feeding goals, please visit www.highplainsfeedyardllc.com or call 620-846-2226. We want to thank all of our great sponsors for today and all of our days of Cattle U, like High Plains Feedyard, for helping us put on this virtual event. You'll be able to find more information about them and the services and products they have to offer in your registration packet and materials that were emailed to you this week. You can also find more information online at cattleu.net. And now, without further ado, it's time to get started with our first speaker of the day, Dr. Miles Theurer. Dr. Theurer grew up on a family farm and cow-calf operation in South Central Kansas. He did a dual DVM PhD program at Kansas State University. His PhD was in epidemiology, focusing on experimental design and statistical analysis. Currently, he is the research director for Veterinary Research and Consulting Services and evaluates data for the consulting group and their clients. Miles works directly with pharmaceutical companies, feed yard managers, and consultants to develop and execute research projects to improve the health and efficiency of cattle in the feed yard. Dr. Theurer, Miles, welcome, and I'll turn it on over to you.
Well, thank you and good morning. I look forward to the opportunity to kick off Cattle U. Just like everyone else, I wish we were in person, but I think this will be a great opportunity to share some of the information, not only from myself here with the audience, but looking forward to the rest of the presentations throughout the week. Go ahead and get started. I was going to start here with the looking at some issues that we've seen with the mid-feeding period morbidity in high-performing cattle. And so get this switched over here. And so just to give you guys a little bit of background about veterinary research and consulting services, we're based out of Hays, Kansas, and we founded back in 1984 by Dr. Dale Miles. There's currently 11 veterinary think tanks where we collaborate with each other and share information for things what we see across in certain areas. So we have nutrition background, immunology, epidemiology, and so a lot of us are based. All of our practices are based upon evidence-based medicine. And so here's a list of the other consultants in BRCS, and none of this would be possible today without the team collaborative effort. And to give you an overview, just a little bit about the different visuals of the feed yards. You see represented by the blue dots. Those are primarily our areas of interest, but you can see everywhere from Texas to Washington and everywhere in between. We also do some backgrounding work in a few dairy operations as well. So we get to see cattle from 72 feed yards across the United States. And every day there's over 2 million head of cattle on feed that we're providing veterinary services for. So we get to see a lot of breadth over the types of cattle and things going on into the industry. So we move into the top presentation today. We looked at what the cow-calf producer in the entire beef industry has been selecting for high-performing cattle throughout the years. They've selecting for these high average daily gain, improved feed efficiency, and carcass quality, looking at the carcass weights and then the quality grade standpoints. Anecdotally, we've seen an increase in BRD and later days on feed. When we see respiratory disease or bovine respiratory disease in the feed yard, most commonly results in an antibiotic treatment. And throughout all that calf's life stage, there's significant resources that's invested at this stage of production. So you look at the from the cow-calf producer, the feed and water to get it through there, it goes through the backgrounding phase, and then get to the feed yard. We're at the end of that production cycle, and we need to make sure that we utilize all of our resources responsibly. And any morbidity detracts from the advantages of selecting these superior animals. However, there's no formal studies have been performed evaluating potential causes of morbidity in these high-performing cattle. And I'll give a disclaimer here that unfortunately I won't, at the end of this, I won't have the end-all answers over what we're seeing or how to fix this problem, but I will go through a lot of the information, what we put together, and try to refine what this population is. So to begin with, we need to think about the BRD complex. And so with this, there's always three components that's involved in disease. So you have the host, which includes the age, the immunity, nutrition, environment, so the animal density, weather, pain conditions, and then also the pathogen. So those are the ones that we commonly think of from your bovine herpes virus, BVD, Mannheimia, Pasteurella. Those are common ones that we see associated with respiratory disease. However, if any one of those three becomes out of bounds, that is when the opportunity for disease to control can occur. So if we think a little bit here from the historic feed yard death loss, we looked at the USDA NOMS data from 1999 to 2011. We've only seen an increase in 23.1% increase over these past 12 years. Now, these are closeout information. You know, a lot of things have changed over the time. We're extending cattle, longer days on feed, a lot of things what we're using today. However, you look at from the overall health and health outcomes, we are not making advancements. In fact, we're going the opposite way. And so, but you can see here that this issue didn't just occur overnight either. This has been something that's been moving this direction across the industry for a period of time. Here's a graph from the USDA AMS data looking at the historical carcass outcomes over the years, so from 1994 to 2018. The red line there is the steer carcass weight. The blue line would be your heifer carcass weight. And then the black line, which is plotted against the right side, you can see the prime and choice outcomes. You can see those steer weights, and continued here from today, even longer with the COVID situation and extended days on feed, have continued to basically increase in a pretty linear fashion over time. So we're still asking these cattle to produce more and more pounds. And also, you know, you look there from the rapid progress, primarily driven by the cow-calf producers with the genetic selection from 2006 to where we are today, where we're grading over 85% prime and choice. It's been a remarkable turnaround from the feed yard standpoint and has continued to open more doors and markets for the industry. But we don't need to take some of these into consideration when we think about the physiological capabilities of these cattle today and what we're asking them to do. So when we think about what are some historical morbidity patterns, this was a paper presented by Babcock back in 2010 that looked at respiratory disease in the feeding period. And basically they identified there were 7 different temporal patterns with BRD occurring in the feedlot. However, so here where you see those 1 through 7 there, only 13% of these that occurred here in pattern 6, and an additional 5% occurred in pattern 7. So you see here this pattern 7, you have this inflection point here about 65 days on feed, and then the cumulative morbidity starts to increase. Over here on the left side is where majority of those different patterns occur. and where we commonly think about respiratory disease in the feed yard. Think about the first 30, 45 days on feed, get through the bulk of those pulls, and then morbidity will subside. You will have some tail end fallout from those, but you can see here from the historical pattern that most of that is occurring earlier on into the feeding period. And we think about a little bit of the industry morbidity distribution. Here's a data set that was put together with over what the lot morbidity outcomes were. The morbidity, mean morbidity there is 12%, and the median on a lot level basis was 7%. So again, have majority of these cattle are predominantly healthy throughout the feeding industry, but we do have this long right tail here where some cattle downbreak with respiratory disease. Now with this data set, it wasn't broken out by high risk calves, low risk calves, so lots of information in there, but it's just trying to provide a holistic approach over what's going on with the different things in the industry. So putting that all together, we put together as part of the ICASA organization, which is the International Consortium for Antimicrobial Stewardship in Agriculture. It's a FR program, and one of our working groups is really focused on this mid-feeding period morbidity and late day mortality to figure out how we can make more responsible use of not only antimicrobials, but also the cattle health and welfare throughout the supply chain. And so what the initial project through the organization was to identify potential causes of BRD in these high performing cattle, and to provide a lot of the pilot work to help drive future research. And so a lot of this information today I'll share with you is the status from this results of this project. So the breakout, the first thing I was going to share with you was some retrospective temporal BRD patterns in high performing and high risk populations that was collected here at High Plains Feedyard. And so we chose the high risk population just as a comparison group, so we can have a better visualization over here's one type of population where disease is occurring, and here's another group. What are those two similar, different, or what's going on there? And so here is the graph that's showing each of the morbidity and mortality in the high risk population, there by the green blue line, and then the red line there with the high performing cattle with the cumulative BRD incidence. Days on feed there on your x-axis and BRD incidence on your y-axis. So these high-risk calves would have all been cattle based off of a risk assessment, subjective risk classifications that were administered metaphylaxis. And these high-performing cattle were categorized by being into our top 25% for average daily gain, feed conversion, and quality grade. So really kind of intriguing here about day 45 in these high performing cattle is when we start to see this outbreak of respiratory disease. And so when you look here compared to their high risk calves, we're through the bulk of morbidity with those. And so that was our we're constantly seeing what's going on in the field or more familiar with because we see those cattle more frequently. But this high performing cattle appears to be breaking at a later time point, very similar to those temporal patterns 5, 6, and 7 that I showed earlier. So what's driving some of those things? And here's just a different way of breaking it out over the cumulative total percent over BRD cases. So here at day Day 45, we're sitting at about 33% of BRD, which has occurred during these high-performing cattle. However, when in the high-risk calves, you're closer to 70%. Just to give you some way over how to interpret some of these outcomes. And here's a table that's just summarizing the number of different lots and their in weights and performance outcomes in these high performing and high risk calves that we use for analysis. And just to provide a descriptive outcome for you to get a feel for that study population. So you can see there, those high performing calves still from an average daily gain and conversion, health outcomes are still light years ahead from the high risk calves. But we just kind of, you know, there's still a lot of room for improvements there. And so this is the reason and the drive over how we can help prevent some of these morbidity issues or what's causing these morbidity issues, so we can further manage them here on the feed yard side is warranted. So shifting gears, through the ACASA program, we had a great cooperation with the Noble Research Institute, and we looked at the repeatability of health outcomes, and so did a retrospective analysis of what they have put together from calves that they followed throughout their production supply chain. And their cattle background would be mostly Bos Taurus, English or English Continental Cross, maybe a slight influence of Boston Indicus, primarily spring calf, fall weaned, preconditioned for 60 days or more, and had 2 rounds of black leg, viral respiratory disease, 1 round of shipping fever, being dewormed, castrated, and dehorned if needed. From a preconditioning for management strategy, for what we know today from handling cattle, we could not ask for a better vaccination management program was what they put together. So looking at those calves from a little over 4,300 calves that they followed throughout the supply chain, looking at their cumulative morbidity risk, you can see here that more of this is occurring earlier on in the feeding period. However, still even after day 45 in this feed yard, there's still a pretty good population, or over a third of these calves are still breaking with respiratory disease. So with that, what's going on with that population, or how can we better manage and influence prevention of that for the future? And repeating that from a different feed yard in Texas, still sees pretty similar results as what we did from the Kansas yard. Here, the morbidity, you know, like I said, it's more front end loaded. We see more morbidity. Is that related to transportation stress, just the adaptation to the feed yard? Are these two the same? Are these two separate issues? That's what we're trying to further evaluate. But still repeatedly in both of these populations, we see incidents occurring later in the feeding period. So broke out a little bit over health outcomes by cow-calf operation. And so here's a data set that's put together looking at this. This is just summarizing here. On the top rows would be the number of calves that received modified live, Mannheimia, and Histophilus vaccines. And then down below would be the number of cow-calf operations from their data set. And then here for each one of these, would they receive 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4 vaccines prior to coming to the feed yard. Trying to look into this from the vaccine management strategy, what's being done to those calves prior to the feed yard, how is that setting those cattle up for success or failure once they're here. So here's a graph we're looking at the number of modified live vaccines. They're on the x-axis by BRD first treatment on the y-axis. You can see there from and the way to interpret this graph is you see any any of those vaccines with letters not connecting, those are actually statistically different. So in this comparison, the calves that were given only one modified live prior to the feed yard actually have a lower BRD first treatment risk compared to those calves that were given 3 times. So emphasizing that more modified lives are not better, not necessarily better. Now, there's still lots of confounding that goes into this, and we try to account for that from the statistical model by including in the ranch, the cow-calf operation. And we also were not able to look at the timing over when those vaccines occurred because there wasn't enough data to split out looking at timing and the number of vaccines in this. So is this a perfect take-home solution? No, but it does provide some credence that a lot of this issue going on from the feed yard, we're not going to be able to manage it through a needle. We're going to need to look at it from a holistic approach from the host and environment side in order to make advancements. Looking at there were no difference in kids that were administered 0, 1, or 2 histophilus vaccines prior for BRD morbidity. And I would agree with the published literature out there summarizing those results. And there was also no difference in kids vaccinated 1, 2, or 3 times for Mannheimia hemolytica for vaccines. The published literature will show a reduction in morbidity and mortality when vaccinated 1 time. And as part of the herd health protocol requirements involved with the Noble Research Institute, they had to receive a minimum of 1 Mannheimia vaccine. They also had to receive a minimum of 1 viral vaccine. So you know what? Don't go taking away from this that vaccines aren't helpful. We need to throw them all out the door. There is a time and a place for them. However, necessarily more may not always be better. So we did some small case studies looking at some virus and bacterial prevalence in these mid-feeding period morbidity outcomes. And so these were cases that were occurring here 60, 70 days on feed. This was done here at High Plains Feedyard. And we looked at the viral responses from PCR. And these were nasal swabs. And you can see here there's a limited data set here. 4 cases, 4 controls, and then we also looked at 2 healthy cohorts. Enough to take drastic take-homes from this? No, but does start to provide some of that information here over, is this standpoint from a viral component? All of these were negative for IBR, BVD, and BRSV. See some positive and negatives there with the coronavirus and influenza. However, you also see those in some of these healthy cohorts where we selected as well. So looking at this, you know, so the PCR is only evaluating the presence over the pathogen. It's not getting down from a genotype standpoint. So are there certain genes, just because it's positive in the control for influenza, is that the positive, is it the pathogen that's causing disease in there as well, the certain genotype? We don't know. We didn't have that from this analysis. Here are the same case and controls looking at them from the bacterial swabs. And you can see stuff kind of all over the place here as well. See positive results for Mannheimia, but we also see positive results there in the controls as well. And so a lot of this just trying to put together from a veterinary practice standpoint, you get the opportunity to select some cases. You also need to take into consideration in looking at your controls to determine if this is the actual pathogen that's causing for disease. So how do you start to have make better decisions? And start to kind of wrap up. One of the last projects we put together was effects of rate of gain and backgrounding on feedlot BRD. So with Noble Research Institute, we put together a group, two groups, small calves here, 56 head in each one of these. However, we looked at different randomizations over preconditioning them for 80 days with the represented by the orange bar, or preconditioned for 197 days before they came into the feed yard. Lots of confounding in this data set standpoint, but we're trying to look at what can those management strategies, trying to get some really better pilot data over what's being done to those cattle prior to entering to the feed yard, just setting up for success or failure here. Here you can see that, you know, the cattle that were preconditioned for 197 days, we still ended up with a 9% cumulative morbidity, and all but one of these cases was occurring after 30 days on feed, when we traditionally think of our most common incidence of respiratory disease. And these calves would have been through ration transitions all during this time frame. And so really kind of scratches our head and figures out how can we better make improvements here. We took that data set because we took a lot of serial weights on those cattle and looking at their average daily gain. We looked at them because we had birth weights, weaning weights, yearling weights, weights on here on arrival to the feed yard, 30, 60 days, reimplants as well. And here's probably one of the standpoints that started to stick out, one to further evaluate was the healthy bar calves were at average daily gain through the first 30 days on feed. And this would have been from the arrival processing weight until the weights that were done at 30 days in both of those two treatment groups. The blue bars were the healthy calves, and the red orange bars were the calves that were diagnosed with respiratory disease, and the purple bars are where those two histograms overlap. You can see there that those calves that are with respiratory disease were on the lower end of this average daily gain standpoint through the first 30 days. There's a lot of our theory, and my hypothesis before looking at this was, were some of these cattle just growing at such a fast rate during this initial feeding phase that were outgrowing their physical capabilities. After putting this data together, kind of switched my thinking around here and going, are these calves, are they subclinical from this standpoint, and we don't see them occurring until later on into the feeding period, or are these calves, are they not eating or not eating enough to support gain and their immune function during this initial phase? Is there a single thing along this, or are there lots of things that go together? Short answer is at this point, we don't know, but it's something that sure have an interest in further looking at. So kind of to wrap this up, unfortunately, morbidity and mortality in these high-performing cattle is greater than expected and occurs at later days on feed compared to the high-risk calves. As additional research is needed to further evaluate this, we don't have the answers all put together here. And to do this, the beef industry must continue to work together up and down the supply chain to better understand the issues and what factors all went into those, so we can make more improvements throughout the chain. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions anyone may have.
Well, hey, thank you, Dr. Theurer Miles. All right, folks, remember, we will take a look at the questions that you will submit during the presentation. Just click on that chat box and type it in the box that appears to the side. We'll try to get to as many of those as we can in the time that we have. So while we wait for those questions to start coming in, Miles, you gave an excellent presentation. I remember talking with you when we were starting to plan Cattle U back in March. You brought this subject up, and it was it happens to everybody, but nobody wants to talk about it. And this is really something that up and down the chain, from the cow-calf guys to the stockers to the feeders, everybody has a stake in the game, right?
That's correct. Everyone here, you know, at the end of the day, I always like to remind feed yard managers, whether we admit it or not, that our ultimate goal is 100% death loss. It's just timing over when that is. But for that to occur at the packing plant, for everyone to reap the rewards of all the work that's been put into those calves from the cow-calf producer, they went through a backgrounding phase, through the feed yard. We think of all the feed, water, time, labor. That's something that everyone is in this together, and it's going to take everyone working together to make improvements.
So you brought up some interesting things. In the research that you all have been looking at with Noble and with the other groups, is there a certain breed, or is there a certain certain stud or anything along those lines that kind of pops out at us? Is there anything that we can do when we're making those decisions about what we're planning for the next 2 years crop of calves? Is there something we can do at the cow-calf level and just say, okay, let's try this?
So to answer the first question, is there any specific breed related to this? You know, we anecdotally see this in a lot of these English and continental crosses. However, you look at the population in the feed yard, they are more represented by these English and continental crosses. So I mean, that's where some of the gets a more thought over, we have our eyes on, but there's also more of those in there. And is that directly, so to answer your question, I don't think there is a specific breed that's with that. It's work that needs to be further evaluated to see from the genetics host standpoint over what is there any relationship there, and how do we manage around that if there is. At this point, we don't know. Second question related to specific things from a cow-calf producer to change or implement in their practice to help make improvements here. Unfortunately, this showed you that, you know, more vaccine, maybe they're not always better. Management strategies, this isn't a one size, a simple solution for a simple problem. This is a truly multifactorial problem. And so when you think of from, you know, timing of vaccines, management strategy, weaning, through the backgrounding phase, what does all that set up to go there to seeing the stuff that we're seeing in the feed yard? What levers have to be tripped to make that go together? At this point, we don't have a good enough answer for that. And the rewards over the cow-calf producer from making the genetic selection and seeing those quality grades and the carcass weights, you know, that has made tremendous growth for the beef industry. We don't want to go backwards in that, but we need to figure out better over where's those optimal endpoints for everything here, if they even are related.
So you brought up an interesting point that we have some heavier cattle right now because of COVID. You know, we had the backlog, as it were, to get through the plants and everything. So we've seen they're getting heavier in the feed yards. That seems like it's putting a little bit more stress on the animal, as it were, on the physiology of the animal. I mean, if you're carrying an extra, 100 pounds or so, it's gonna have a little bit more of effect on your internal organs, I can imagine, right?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, we think of the bovine as already a cardiopulmonary, so lung and heart challenged animal compared to, say, a horse standpoint. When you look at the volume in the lung field, so oxygen exchange there. That's why horses, from the Kentucky Derby, they can go run tremendous races, and cattle, we're moving cattle to the packing plant with lead riders, moving them in a slow method just to keep everything calm, cool, relaxed standpoint. And so with those, any, you know, have we put those cattle under more physiological strain? We believe so, but a lot of those, keeping those management strategies, so just moving cattle in a calm, cool, collected method, truly can make as much impact there.
So that brings to mind, you know, our pen riders and our feedlots are number one contact point for all of those cattle. What can they do to help out with this? What are some things when you're talking with pen riders and as you go out and consult with folks, you know, how can they identify maybe a calf that may end up having having a little bit of trouble here and there? What can they do?
So this is probably one of the ones that's extremely frustrating for our pen riders and our feed yard managers, because from the common mindset, through 45 days, you get cattle and you're pretty well bulletproof from there, and then seeing this issue kind of more and more frequently, it frustrates the pen riders, because you know, these cattle, from the disease onset behind them, occurs so rapidly. With these cattle being bigger, we have more fat cells, adipose tissue on those cattle, and they're under more physiological stress. But we think of the thought process is those adipose tissues is like an ammunition box for all the immune responses. So if anything will trip that calf over to result in disease, it has so much more firepower to result in this in really significant rapid onset of disease. The first time that I was thrown into this issue here from High Plains, pen riders were going through them in the morning. I was walking the pens in the afternoon, and there were still deads behind both of us. I'm not a perfect pen rider standpoint, I don't claim to be, but I would say that there's it really can occur that rapidly, and so keeping the pen riders, you know, because they're riding through them and have had very minimal issue, and how do we keep those? We work with those to say, here's some populations where we think that this could occur. Keep your eyes on them. You know, we ask those pen riders to look at a lot of cattle, and you know, from the labor shortage standpoint, how do you keep those cattle really engaged on certain pens throughout the feeding period? And then also from the feed yard managers to let them know that this is occurring. It's not occurring just here at High Plains and with noble cattle. Our consulting group has seen this across multiple feed yards, and a lot of things been moving forward. So it is occurring across the entire industry.
Just a reminder, folks, we've got Dr. Miles Theurer here. He just presented on mid-feeding morbidity in our feedlot cattle. I commend you for being able to say morbidity, because it's a very difficult one for me to say, Miles. Folks, if you've got a question for Dr. Theurer, go ahead and put that in the chat box there. We just talked a little bit about pen riders. You talked a little bit about the facilities. Are there facility upgrades that we could do? If I was going to wave a magic wand and money was no option, are there some facility upgrades that can help us reduce the number on these larger animals that we've got in the feedlots?
A great question, and something I've had some thought into before, but unfortunately, I don't think this is a single issue. I think it's going to take a little piece here and a little piece there and a little piece there to fully figure out what that full complete picture is, and then to make those management decisions. I mean, if this was a single management change or a single change, I think as an feedlot industry, we would have made that change. We would have, you know, rolled on with this and moved on down the road. However, we have not been able to date get our hands completely grasped around this and fully understand what all are the causative effects here. So I don't think there can be just a single thing that we can make that to better make a decision.
Okay. Well, Dr. Theurer, I'm not seeing any more questions from the audience. Folks, remember, if you didn't feel like you had time to ask a question, or you wanted to make sure and ask your question privately, Dr. Theurer will be on the rest of this session, and he'd be happy to take those questions there at the end. We're going to go ahead and keep moving through our process here. Before we go back to Dr. Theurer for his second presentation regarding stocker cattle, we want to take a brief moment to recognize some of our sponsors for today's session. Thanks, Dr. Theurer. We'll see you in a little bit. We want to thank all of our sponsors, but right now we have coming to our session, Dr. Joe Gillespie, who's a professional services veterinarian for Boehringer Ingelheim. Dr. Gillespie, the slides are yours.
Thank you. Appreciate the chance to sponsor this session with Dr. Theurer, and appreciate the opportunity to be available to everyone at the Cattle U this morning. Hopefully everyone can see my slides there. Thank you for the time again, Jenna. But Boehringer Ingelheim Animal Health USA is proud to sponsor part of this session today. I just wanted to give you a brief appreciation for who we are and what we can offer the animal health industry. And Dr. Theurer was talking about a lot about health this first session, and I'm sure he'll cover a lot about health in the second session. And that's something at BI, that's part of our mission. The mission of Boehringer Ingelheim is to protect animals against disease, help animals, help those who care for animals, and then go beyond medicine to better predict, detect, and prevent animal diseases. We are a global company that's in the business of creating health and prevention for our customers. And what does that mean to put cattle first and put our teams first? That includes advanced deworming, animal health and well-being, trying to keep our calves healthy, judicious use of antibiotics, and ultimately the understanding that prevention works. There's lots of confounders, just like Dr. Theurer talked about, that have an influence on disease in our livestock, and we have to be prepared for all of those. It could be lots of different types of stressors. It could be disease. It could be parasitism. There's a lot of things that have impact, and we need to be thinking about all those. And one of our goals at BI is to help put cattle first. And we are partnering with you and work hard to ensure the cattle industry is successful for the next generation of producers. When we think about sustainability, in a lot of cases, that's about who are we going to be working with next. We do have in our portfolio quite a few cattle first offerings. Many of them are recognizable to you, but I would just offer them today. We have long-range, a long-acting epinamectin dewormer for use in growing livestock. We have 2 full lines of vaccines. We have the Express FP line, which is important in our cattle reproduction. We have Pyramid 5 and Pyramid 5 Plus Presponse, which is a 5-way respiratory that we see used in calves with the Mannheimia that Dr. Theurer talked about. And the Noble Foundation, one of the requirements is a 5-way viral that includes the Mannheimia. Obviously, we have Zactran, which is a macrolide long-acting antibiotic. And then finally, we have topical porons, Epronex and Ivermec that could be part of anyone's program. Again, we have a whole offering of different products that fit in the animal health industry. And this is one of the opportunities for us to get in front of you and just offer the advice that we're here to help prevent disease and help work with you as producers to provide a better product at the end for the consumer. So again, on behalf of BI, we are putting cattle first. We're thankful for the opportunity to support this program today. And if you need any information about BI, just go to our website at bicattlefirst.com or visit your local BI representative. Thank you very much, Jenny, and that's all I have today.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Gillespie, for joining us. Thanks to Boehringer Ingelheim and to all of our sponsors, including High Plains Feedyards, for our sponsors of our virtual Cattle U. As you can imagine, we're trying to bring our great trade show to you folks there at home. You'll be hearing from all of our great sponsors and many more throughout the series of sessions this week. You can also read more about their products and services in the digital program that will be emailed to all registrants. Well, now let's bring back Dr. Theurer for his second presentation, Stocker Operation, Optimization of Health, Performance, and Economic Outcomes. This topic, like we said, is brought to you by Boehringer Ingelheim. Miles, the screen is yours.
Thank you. And thank you for the work of BI for sponsoring this session. It's been great. As Dr. Gillespie said, to really do a company that does work in trying to put cattle health first, and has been great advocates for the industry. Here from this section, we're going to talk a lot about from the stocker operation, what's optimization of health, performance, and economic outcomes. So kind of had these same introduction slides, won't rehash those. I think we have most of our same participants. But here's just a list of the other veterinarians in the group, and we're based throughout the United States. It's really 11 veterinary think tank, and so a lot of us can work and collaborate off of each other to come up with ideas and solutions for problems. And there's another just visual overview of the current feed yards. like I said, primarily we're the feed yards you see from the blue dots. We do some backgrounding yards and a few dairy operations as well. But our primary emphasis is located on the feed yard side. So to start off with the disclaimers for this project is I have provided consulting services and or conducted research projects for multiple pharmaceutical and feed additive companies. I don't have a problem accepting a check for services. The way that BRCS operates is we do not sell or distribute any products. When we try to make recommendations for implementing a program, we want to make sure that we have some data to support that practice before we implement this. For many of the information that I share with you here today, or even from the first presentation, prior to making any of these changes, I recommend consultation with your herd health veterinarian. Recommend and encourage and strongly encourage that this needs to be done. They have the valid veterinary client-patient relationship with you from the cow-calf stocker operation. And there may be very specifics of why certain strategies are included in the current protocol. There's not a one-size-fits-all protocol development, and that's why a lot of the times, based off of risk assessment, what the practices performed on each facility, a lot of decision and thought process goes behind the development of those, and so they're the ones that ultimately need to have those final discussions before making any changes for your operation. So as we talk a little bit about stocker backgrounding, just thought it'd be important to highlight a little, just some case definitions for what's commonly used in the feed in the industry. So a lot of times we'll refer to backgrounding as that intermediate stage between weaning and feedlot. Can be as high roughage diet and can be in confinement or pasture. In stockers, there's also that intermediate stage between weaning and feedlot. We more commonly refer to those as pasture-based and supplement as needed. For a lot of the stuff that I'm going to be used today, I'll go back and forth from backgrounding and stockers. A lot of the stuff that we're talking about can be used interchangeably. And that's where the terminology is used commonly in the industry. But I just wanted to highlight those two different definitions so everyone's aware. So why do we background calves? So here's just some overview philosophies over from the health management, especially in these high-risk calves. Going through a backgrounding operation, you can use those, you can provide more care and resources to those compared to a commercial feed yard, because there's more time that you can elevate evaluating for sickness. You can utilize vast forage resources. So we talked about the pasture, the grazing operation, and it can provide an additional income source for the farmers. Crop residues, small grain forages to help walk it off as pounds, and in lower cost of gain compared to the feed yard. So looking at that, you can put pounds on cheaper on the backgrounding side compared to the feed yard. However, at the end of it, when you get from a longer days on feed, there's more energy required to go into maintenance and growth. That's where the feed yard becomes more advantageous because it needs more of those energy dense caloric intake, like corn, high moisture corn, those sorts of practices to make a difference. So thinking about a lot of this, I put this together. So here's the Chicago Mercantile Exchange future quotes. And I captured this on August 4th, 2020. And you can think of whatever you want from the Mercantile Exchange. There's some advantages or disadvantages. However, from the feed yard side, this is where their cattle are going to be priced accordingly. Commonly, feed yard operators will look at the board and figure out when those cattle will be finished based off of which month they will be finished, and help determine the price with those. And so here you can see kind of highlighted here the difference from the August board. Historically, COVID being somewhat of an abnormality in some ways, looking from an August to an October spread over $5 a pound. You look there from April to June, you go back to $6.45. And so knowledge over when those cattle will be harvested based off of their outweight from the backgrounding operation helps determine those prices. Now there's market abnormalities and things that, is it an end all be all? No, but this is kind of the basic fundamental principles of our cattle pricing. The opportunity for stocker and backgrounders to, how can you slow cattle, their growth rate down to move those instead of cattle being harvested in August? Can you slow rate again down and get those cattle to kill and on the October board? And there's opportunities there, and it can result in a more profitable outcome for the operation if you can do that in a cost-effective manner. And so a lot of times you get to supply chain logistics, and we have to have cattle gone by day X to fit into your operation. So there are certain times when this doesn't work or may work, but here's an idea for you to have an idea over from a pricing mechanism. And the other thing to look at this was the average live cattle basis from 2014 to 2018 over. And so this would have been what the live cattle trade sell for the average for that month compared to what the futures board was for there. You can see here those positive May, June, April, May, June, July there was positive basis. And you know, as that trend kind of stay true, does it vary from year to year? Yeah, there's lots of market impacts with that, but just kind of provide this for you an overview over here's where some of the CME and the basis, historical basis, a lot of those would be used to help determine what that purchase price is to figure in for a break even. So what's the biggest health challenges in stockers? And I worked a lot with Dr. Bob Smith and with some presentations he gave. Respiratory disease is still the most common issue on the stocker side as well. So represent from about 88% of the death loss. Some of the miscellaneous products that we see, some frothy brood on wheat, rye, triticale, musculoskeletal issues, pink eye in summer. Miscellaneous varies by year and by operation. A lot of things are very site specific over what else kind of combines in those, and a lot of that depends on what the cattle were when they came into the stocker operation. You know, if you bought a set of solid calves and you're just backgrounding them, then the respiratory disease isn't quite as big of an issue. If they're high risk calves, then it's looking you right in the face. And so knowledge, a lot of that varies by the purchase origin. And so here's just a classic fibrinous pneumonia case. You can see here from necropsy, over 80%, closer to 80% of that lung looks to be consolidated. And see here from my indicator, the kind of line of demarcation with everything down below would be infected due to respiratory disease. So this would be a treatment failure and resulted in subsequent death. So knowledge, I talked a lot about what is it when they're coming into the backgrounding operation, looking at what those cattle were prior to going into a market situation. And so DL Step, when it was with Oklahoma State, did some historical comparison looking at calves that were weaned. Weaned 45 days. They were weaned and vaccinated for 45 days, or comparing them just some market origin cattle. So these calves that were weaned were sent directly to the operation standpoint and not there at the herd of origin. You can see here from the morbidity treatment, both of these cows were weaned 45 days and weaned back 45 days. Those have significant impact and reduction in BRD morbidity compared to cattle that were just asphalt weaned or market origin, which would have been most likely, asphalt weaned to the cell barn and then transported back to the feeding station as well for the research project. So you can see there that highlight this is of your knowledge over what you're purchasing from the stocker operation, from what was been done to those calves prior, can help provide you some guidance and expectations over health outcomes there in the operation. And so what is BRD morbidity and average daily gain in high-risk steers and bull stocker calves? So looking at these calves were non-mass treated upon arrival. You can see there from the cattle, which were bulls, purchased as bulls, had a 78% morbidity first treatment. Steer mates were only 51%. These are numbers that we commonly see and attribute to in the feed yard side over, so the opportunity to buy that intact male, castrate them, band them, those management strategies, however you achieve that, and compared to steer mates, you will result in increased morbidity and mortality outcomes. And you can see there from the average daily gain standpoint as well. So the steers outperform those. Now, does it come down from a cost-effective standpoint? And that takes some time working with your specific operation, knowing cost inputs, labor availability, and what the capabilities of are from your site, and how much trauma that you can really go through by going through all of these intact bulls and going through that process. It's not an easy procedure, but it can easily be done in the right circumstances. So here was a study that we looked at on bulls here at High Plains Feed Yard, looked at the distal splitting of the scrotum when banding feedlot bulls, and we're looking at performance outcomes and healing time. And here at the right is we looked at a visual, drew a visual description, visual picture over what that was done. And so you can see here at the top was where the band was placed. And we took a Newberry knife and slit through the distal scrotum and looking at what was going on. We had 32 bulls and we randomized them 2 ways. And we looked at those, the ones that we split and left those that were intact, or intact meaning band only. So all bulls are banded, but one of them we left just banded normally, the other one we split. And we've had lots, this type of project was put together with Fort Hays State University, and we had a big interest in this because this was a common issue, what we see from our backgrounding and our feedlot side over how do we handle these cattle. Everyone had their own thoughts and ideas with this, and so we tried to put together a study to evaluate it. So we evaluated the scrotal health at 14, 28, and 56 days. And you can see here at 14 days, none of the calves that were intact had the scrotum fell off or was absent. However, 18% of those calves that were split had it fell off. They're at 28 days. You can see by a more rapid healing time in the calves that were split compared to intact. And by day 56, the scrotum had fell off on all of those. So looking at that, you know, these were 950-pound bulls. These were bulls that did not make from a breeding program. When we had them housed in grow safe pens, so we were monitoring individual animal intake. When we were evaluating the scrotal health, we were actually capturing body weights as well. And so you can see here, numerical advantages here at days 14 and 21, and at day 56 with the p-value of 0.06, we saw a greater average daily gain in the bulls that were split compared to intact. And so with that, helped us provide more better recommendations for us moving forward. So we moving on to the next topic, a lot of PI BVD, so bovine viral diarrhea virus exposure. This was looking at the morbidity outcomes. And so put together a literature review over looking at all of the PI exposures, in looking at them from the so here's where pins here in the first column, which were morbidity that was from unexposed pins. So there was not a persistently infected BVD calf in there. Here on the right side was from their groups where a persistently infected BVD calf was involved. And so take example, this groom study, you know, it was 19% morbidity unexposed versus 39% that was exposed. So looking at almost double the morbidity. Some of these calves, you know, Hay saw a similar response. Some of these calves not seeing a lot of difference in here. I also highlight here from the O'Connor side. So these in Richardson was looking at unexposed and exposed to a persistently infected calf from a single source or versus from a commingled source. One of the things you can take home from both of those tables is single source cattle have better health outcomes than commingled source. And so knowledge over how many sources of cattle that are put together helps predict what the morbidity outcomes may be. So we say this because there's a lot of efforts that can be done from vaccination from BVD, but also from testing these PI calves on feed yard arrival. And what does that do to health outcomes in feed yards? Here was some more data looking at the mortality and the chronic data. So from those studies, this article has been published in Bovine Practitioner, looking at what's the mortality and chronic standpoints in those exposed to BVD, a PI calf, or unexposed. And so these would be pins. You can see here from the mortality, you know, from the Hessman study standpoint, you're looking at over double the mortality. However, you look in the other studies, not a lot of difference. The chronic standpoints here from the Richardson all, you're looking at 7 times more in exposed, but however, there's still some more numerical disadvantages to being exposed. So overall, looking at the PI exposure, does it have a great impact over health and performance outcomes? Absolutely. So now we wanted to look through, and I can just kind of summarize the slide here, getting ahead of myself. But does it impact health outcomes? Absolutely. But there's a great amount of variation. So there are sometimes multiple different strains, sometimes with that pathogen virulence factor, the genotype, what those baseline health status was, may all attribute to the range of effects. But generally resulted in decreased health and performance outcomes. And so the logical thing through making recommendations was if exposure resulted in decreased performance outcomes, the logical step would result in testing and removing PI BVD calves to hopefully remove outcomes. And so that was the next part of the study where we actually looked at, here was all of the data, published data, And so when I say this was published, these would be in peer-reviewed journals looking at continuous PI BVD exposure or calves that were tested and removed to PI BVD exposure. And so here is all the data that's put together comparing these. You can see there from the feed to gain comparison, there's quite a numerical reduction or improvement in testing and removing. However, you look at the rest of the data, not a lot of difference there. Right? I mean, a very minimal difference there. And then so now you start taking the account over the idea of testing to the time and effort and the dollars that's required from testing. Is that worth it? And so that's a question you would have to ask yourself, and in discussion with your veterinarian, is that worth that? There's just limited amount of data public available in commercial feedlot or backgrounding operations that says that it results in improved health and performance outcomes. So when you think about that, so those PI BVD calves, could they have been shed a virus during the commingling, transportation period, rest period prior to processing and collection of the sample? Could they have already been shedding and exposing all the other animals there, doing the necessary to damage to the result to the pathogen due to horizontal transmission and offsetting the potential effects? Is that a possibility? It's our current theory. However, one of the things though, before just pulling out from testing from a stocker operation, you really need to consider the entire biosecurity protocol. And this is why I definitely emphasize consultation with local veterinarian, because if you are housing replacement heifers or cow-calf production unit that's going through the same set of facilities, then your PI BVD testing is not as, you're using that to mitigate the risk to your cow-calf herd, because that's the way that the virus is transmitted. A lot of the times the calf is infected and recirculates and affects the cow during the mid-gestation period, and then that calf becomes infected, and then it just becomes implemented into your herd, and you see tremendous reduction in pregnancy rates, stillborn deaths, and can have drastic results there. And so if testing is part of from your biosecurity protocol, then then makes a lot more sense. However, you're doing it just from an economic standpoint, expecting results in data in health and performance, the data are limited to support that theory. So moving on to another practice that we commonly see done in backgrounding stocker operation is revaccination. And so why do we revaccinate? So when we administer a vaccine, not all calves respond to an initial vaccination. Common thoughts where we put together from stress, poor nutrition, dehydration, parasitism, incubating infections, mishandling diseases, or vaccines, all of those things can lead to why that calf did not initially respond to the vaccine. Resulting in immunological failures, and there may be in non-responsive animals. So you look from the nutritional side, from your energy, protein, macro and micro minerals, genetic standpoint, those mishandled vaccines, storage, mixing, administration, equipment, dirty syringes, a lot of those things can disinfectant can make a perfectly viable vaccine and turn it to just basically sterile water in an instant. The part other things highlight here from stress, and it's multiple of distress. And so here's just kind of a chart put together over kind of example of the immune status there on the y-axis and the time there on the x. And so you look at what that calf goes through from the weaning, the commingling, that transportation, processing, we change their ration, and you change the weather like what we're having today. Each one of those things can add up and have a significant impact on those health outcomes, or in lowering the immune response. And so knowledge over how those things interact is needed. So now moving back to there's kind of the reasons for commonly see revaccination. So let's talk about the data for revaccination. Here's another study from Oklahoma State, looking at randomization over single vaccination versus revaccination studies. So you can see there's 12 pins, 302, 300 calves. Look there at the BRD morbidity that's bolded there. The calves that were given a single vaccine only had a 36% morbidity, compared to the steers that were given revaccinated actually had a greater morbidity. You can see the rest of the health and performance outcomes there, summarized from the study. However, so we need to really kind of ask ourselves, as stewards, above all, do no harm. Does this revaccination? So we're doing this because we think we're setting calves up for better success down the line. However, if this morbidity, if we're actually increasing morbidity, are we doing better or are we doing worse? And the current data here would show that there's no advantage from revaccination. Again, smaller numbers, and this data is, you can see a little bit on the older side. So is it worth it to see more recent data from in the published literature, in the peer-reviewed literature? Absolutely. However, this is kind of the information, what we have is out there available today. So I kind of told you with a lot of the stuff over what you maybe not some data to look at. And now there's some other stuff here where some help, where you can consider it. And so this was a study we looked at, and this would have been high-risk calves. And we looked at feeding, it was a live yeast called Paternative. It was looking at health outcomes throughout the feeding period. This was done at more of a commercial feed yard. It was done because it's done here at High Plains Feedyard. But you can see there, we had 600 calves, 637 calves, 8 pins in each treatment group. We looked at feeding the Paternative, and it's a Saccharomyces live yeast product. And we fed it for the first 45 days. And we looked at health outcomes here to summarize. You can see there from our BRD first treatment at 45 days, the calves that we was in control was at 15.4% versus the calves were Paternative was at 10.7%, 10.8%. And that was significantly different. And we follow these calves all the way out through the feeding period. And so here's just kind of the temporal graph looking at those cumulative morbidity represented by the solid line, and the mortality is represented by the dashed line. And then the red line are the control calves, and the blue line was the calves that we fed the Paternative to for the first 45 days, represented here by this horizontal bar. Provide this as information for you. So is there ways for you to consider using this in an operation? And it's the first study that's commercial study with a live yeast product that has shown positive response in peer-reviewed literature on health outcomes. And so each one of these, we're looking at a lot of these new feed additives, microbiome, how are we interacting, and how are those things to set those calves up for success? There needs to be a lot more research that goes to this. However, I would also say, that not every product may or may not be the same. There may be very specific, species specific, strain specific, where you see those effects. And so here's just an example of something for you to maybe consider implementing, or how you can, if it has a place in reducing morbidity and mortality for your operation. Again, I circle back and I put this slide back in here from the soccer side, and re-highlight this. That we got to remember that BRD is a complex, and it's the entire host, environment, and pathogen standpoint. And each one of those interact, which may potentially result in disease or not. If any one of those that becomes too severe, resulting, that's where the implement of disease can occur. So take from environment, you can have the perfectly well vaccinated calf, take care of all the pathogens, greatest plan of nutrition. You bring that calf into muddy pens, no bedding, walking up into its hock and mud, more likely going to see respiratory disease issues with those. And so just because of we got to take that holistic approach in order to make advancements. So we think a lot from the management strategies, and we really commonly think of it through as an industry through a needle or a diagnostic test, because it's quick and easy. It's the American philosophy. I mean, that's the way we've kind of been trained to move forward. And a majority of all these products out there are very sound tools. We look at metaphylaxis standpoint, which would be high-risk calves all receiving antibiotics during arrival processing. However, we'll start to wonder, from the philosophize, have they become a crutch for producers to worry about other things? And how do we go back and take care of the whole husbandry aspect? And so we need to really consider the entire animal husbandry sector: bedding, bunk space, water tanks, rest period, those sorts of things. So providing bedding to newly received calves so they can get down and have a chance to rest, and providing ample bunk space. So providing place for calves to get up there to eat, and any chance that we can stimulate that rumen to start to build its own immune system. The rumen is the engine for the feedlot, for cattle. Water tanks. We think a lot of these places, they're used to pond water or running from a creek. A lot of times they never considered drinking from a tank or drinking from an automatic water. So how can we provide different water tanks to those? How do you let them know where water is? So you look at, well, the most essential ingredients for cattle, one is oxygen and two is water. It doesn't matter what else you do to those calves before that. If you're not taking care of those, calf isn't able to drink, it's going to result in dehydration. And we see what it can do to vaccine response and just sets that calf up for failure. However, these take time and effort to implement. And then providing calves a rest period. So, the old adage over get cattle in and need to process them immediately, maybe that's true, maybe that's not. We'd sure rather recommend at least an hour for every 100 miles that they're on a truck, and round that up to the day. So if it's a 6 hour, round it up to give them a day processing and just move on through with them. If you need to provide longer, there's those opportunities as well. We got to think about what that calf has all went through prior to getting to your place, and we're loaded on a truck, very stressful event, offloaded, and now seeing brand new set of facilities and trying to get oriented. So providing those calves opportunities just to rest and recollect themselves can result in great improvement. So kind of wrapping up, you need to know knowledge of your specific goals to determine an optimal protocols, approach, and marketing. There is not a one-size-fits-all approach that can be warranted. And to do this, consultation with your herd health veterinarian, nutritionist, etc., is needed to make any changes. providing them information over what you're seeing, feeling, where you're wanting to go is needed to result in the optimal outcomes for you. Data are limited to support PI BVD testing upon arrival, and there's also no data to support revaccination as well, based off of peer-reviewed literature. And ultimately, you need to consider the entire efforts to mitigate stress from the host and environment side of the BRD complex, as well as the pathogen side, to make improvements in the health outcomes. I put together a list of references here, just kind of what we highlighted through the presentation for people that would like more information, and my contact information will be provided here as well. But this is how a lot of this trying to make evidence-based medicine decision to help support practices. And with that, be happy to answer any questions you may have.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Theurer. I tell you what, agriculture is the only area where we can actually bring a vet on first thing in the morning and nobody bothers. Nobody gets bothered by the slides. Folks, if you have a question, remember you can submit that through the chat function. Just click on the box below and it'll pop up with a box over to the side, and you can type your questions in there and we'll get to those, as many of them as we can. We did have one question come through while you were speaking. We had a question: is the revaccination on arrival and then 2 weeks later, or is that for calf vaccination and then revaccination at weaning? So
the data that Dr. Stepp did from Oklahoma State was looking at vaccination at feed yard arrival and vaccinated 3 weeks later here at the feed yard standpoint. We don't have data, good data to standpoint to say from the cow-calf side, revaccinate at the feed yard standpoint. You know, how quick does that need to go through? What does that holistic life approach need to do? We don't have great data to look at that I'm aware of.
Okay, that also got me to thinking. So when we're looking at the revaccination protocols and vaccination protocols to begin with, you talked about how one of the things is the calf stress itself. Are there things that we can do as a cow-calf guy, knowing that those are going to end up being in the stalker or the backgrounder as their next phase? Is there something that we can do when we're applying those calfhood vaccinations to better prepare them, to not stress them out? Or am I even on the right course?
So one of the big things to do, so vaccinations, there are very effective tools, and have to know when to give those, when does that work in your operation, and what products to use. And so things to do from the main things from low stress handling cattle throughout all the entire process, through when you can administer those cattle. If you can administer those cattle, process them in a very low stress method, those cattle will respond better to vaccines. You'll see better health and performance with those cattle as well. Given those vaccines prior to the feed yard, as you see compared to the market origin or just weaned and shipped to the feed yard, greatly reduced morbidity. The actual standpoint over weaning those calves, you know, they're in an operation, and setting those calves can result in significant ways to set those calves up for success, rather than just loading them on a truck and taking them on down the road. However, now there's some of those times when operations and you know, that it may not be feasible to those. And so those are the opportunities. There's opportunities that you can work with neighbors or other ways to do that. There could be situations there. But at the end of the day, I would say that if there's any efforts that you can do to wean those calves and get those calves vaccinated, it will result in significant improvement throughout the entire supply chain.
You know, my dad raised cattle his entire life, and one of the things he said is our job as a cow-calf producer is to give them the very best 4 hooves forward before they go on to the next fella in the chain, and that way everybody succeeds. So I always like that part of Cattle U is we don't just look at one part of the sector, we look at the whole system from cow-calf to stocker to feedlot. One of the things that we talked about was, or one of the things that we had come up is what role does gain and performance as a stocker or as a backgrounder, what does that do to their performance in the feedlot? If they can get as much on them as they can in the backgrounding portion before they get to the feedlot, does that give them those 4 hooves up?
Great question, Jenny. And with that, so you think of those, we look at, unfortunately, as the beef industry, a lot of times we think of them as segmented industries. So you think of the cow-calf, you think of the stocker and the feedlot. And what you're talking about here with Cattle U, trying to integrate those, more work is definitely needed along those lines. To answer your question, does improved gain at the backgrounding phase? What does that do to the feed yard side? So you think of those cattle are genetically primed for a certain target for growth. And so if more of the growth is taken out of them from the backgrounding side, then there's less opportunities for on the feed yard side. And so with that, so you look at a bigger calf coming to the feed yard, the gains and conversions are lower. And a lot of times, if they're gained more rapidly, we see lower data to support, we'll see lower carcass weight with that. However, if you're at an opportunity looking for a retained ownership where you're the one that's looking from the stocker side and keeping those cattle on the feed yard side, we talked about the cheaper cost of gain. That's money in your pocket. I mean, so now it becomes $1.00, and from it's a math equation, and it doesn't have to be too complicated. But that's where you need to work and try to figure out where the optimal endpoint is to keep them so you don't go too far and take all of the good growth and performance out of them. And the other comment to go with that is, we talk about with health issues on the feed yard side. If someone's saying to me that on the feed yard veterinarian, well, they gained over 4 pounds with me on the backgrounding side, I'm telling them just to hold on because this is probably going to be an ugly ride. When we generally see those cattle that have highly fermentable carbohydrates, any type of nutrition that leads to those, a lot of times those high rate of gain standpoint, those are the cattle where we see subsequent health issues more commonly in the feed yard. And so with that rumen interaction standpoint with them, what's going on with those cattle, but that does seem to commonly set those calves up for failure. So at the end of the, from the feed yard aspect, I say slow and grow, but there's a happy medium. And if you're a cow, if you're a retained ownership person, you'll need to obviously look at your closeouts, look at them segmented from a closeout from a feed yard operation, but look at a combined closeout as well. So, if I brought a calf in at 5 weights and backgrounded them and took them to 850 weights and then transported them to the feed yard, you need to look at them each independently, but you need to look at them combined from that holistic approach.
Folks, remember, if you've got questions, go ahead and click on the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and it'll pop up to the side, and you can type your questions in there. Since we muted all of your microphones and all of your videos, that's the best way that we can ask those questions. While we're waiting on some more to come in from the audience, I've heard that there's a lot more interest in non-antibiotic protocols, if you were. We're trying to get away from the use of antibiotics, and we've got the veterinary protocols that are out there, and there's quite a lot of interest in, I think you brought up the live yeast, for example. What is some of the, if you were to be consulting with somebody, what would you say as far as some of these new products that are coming on the market? What sort of opportunities are there or challenges are there to those?
So there's a lot of the yeast products, and there's other types of products that's in the work that's coming through the pipeline. So I can say from VRCS recommendation is we need to see clinical field data that before we implement these procedures, practices into the field. A lot of these products that will show that in theory that they would work tremendously. I mean, based off the science and the mechanism of action. However, we're dealing with biology, and A plus B does not always equal C. And so that's why before, as a practice, we've always based ourselves to make sure we have that data, the field data, to show that there is something to support these practices before implementation. And a lot of those companies, you can recommend that they show you that data, and so you can make those own decisions on that. I said yeast standpoint, but there's a lot of other things in there as well, from treatment products, and at the end of the day, it comes down to, you know, from a cost-effective standpoint for you as the stocker, as a producer. Well, this product may work so great, but it costs me so much that I'll go bankrupt through it. Well, then that's not a very logical strategy. And so you have to look at the holistic approach, you know, from the health and performance, and can we implement it, but also from the dollars and cents side as well. And so that's, I'd say my recommendation would be not just to take those things lightheartedly, as there's lots of dollars that can add up to moving forward there.
That's sound advice for anything as we're implementing it in our protocols, no matter what sector of the beef business that we're in, right? Always consult with the veterinarian, and always look at the data behind it before you make a decision.
Yeah, and I pulled it out from the presentation, but there was also a lot of data on delaying the use of modified live vaccines. So we talked about a lot of timing earlier, but so we've done collaboration with BI, and we've done some other work in peer-reviewed studies as well, where we've delayed the viral vaccine 30 days on feed. And resulted in improved treatment response, and it was statistically different on that, and a reduction in numerical reduction in mortality, and the numerical. So there, you know, just the things. Does it work in your operation to bring those from instead of a revac, and you look at from a delayed vac standpoint? It's something to consider. So I think there's lots of things and nuances for each specific operation to develop and implement those protocols.
Okay. Well, folks, in case you didn't get your questions asked today, or you just didn't want to put them in the chat box, we'll have Dr. Theurer's contact information for you to be able to reach out to him separately. Dr. Theurer, Miles, thank you so very much for joining us today. Was there anything else that you had as a wrap up that you wanted to remind people before we moved on? I
just wanted to thank you all for taking the time in High Plains Journal for putting this together. I think the speakers lined up here today, the knowledge throughout the supply chain, would be great resources for the entire producers.
Well, hey, thank you for that, Dr. Miles Theurer. And we want to thank our session sponsors, High Plains Feedyard and Boehringer Ingelheim. We want to remind you, you can join us right here at this exact same link at noon, when we are joined by Danette Amstein of Maiden Marketing. She is going to share consumer research into beef buying patterns during the pandemic. This is one of the first times that this information will be available to the public. As you can imagine, it's a topic that a lot of folks are very interested in, because these buying decisions may have, well, they will have effects on our industry to come. We'll also be joined at noon by Brian Bertelson of US Premium Beef. He's going to help us learn how to add value to the cattle that we produce. Remember, that session begins right here at this exact same link at noon today. So grab a lunch and join us for some learning. If you like this format, or if there's something different that we can do, let us know. All registered attendees are going to receive a survey in your email. As you know, if you're a regular attendee of our HPJU events, we take all of the feedback that you give us very seriously. We use that in creating next year's event. As you can imagine, we are reinventing our programming right now, and we could sure use your feedback to make sure that we craft session topics and times that help you. Thank you for helping us make a better experience for you in the future. So on behalf of all of us here at High Plains Journal, thanks for riding with us this morning. And we will see you right here at noon for our very next session of High Plains Journal's Virtual Cattle U.
Dirt road in a gooseneck, saddle up with me. Dry land in God's country, crops far as I can see. The headlights on both ends of my day.